Welcome, this is Najma Minhas with GVS Dialogue. Pakistan's economy is a basket case, so it's no surprise when the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shehbaz Sharif, announced the need to go to the IMF once again. It will be the 25th time that Pakistan's going to the IMF. And this IMF fix that the country needs gets bigger and bigger, and the time in between each program gets shorter and shorter. Pakistan first went to the IMF in 1958 for what is $25,000. Today's money, that would be around $253,000. And ironically, while India was said to be suffering from this Hindu growth rate, Pakistan was racing ahead of its competitors in South Asia from the 1950s till the 1990s. And now it is that sick man of Asia whose human indicators are below those of sub-Saharan Africa. Bangladesh, former East Pakistan, at the time of separation, had a GDP per capita which was less than half of West Pakistan in 1971. Now it has a GDP per capita of $2,500, as compared to India's $2,300 and Pakistan's $1,600. So why is Pakistan on what seems a never-ending road going to nowhere, and how does it come off it? To understand this, I'm joined by Ahmed Jamal Pirzada, a lecturer in economics at Bristol University in the UK and former chairman of the Economic Advisory Group, a think tank in Islamabad. He has co-authored a paper recently on Pakistan's economy stuck in the mud, why Pakistan is falling behind.
I don't understand why I'm poor, and the average Pakistani does not understand why he's poor. He wants to have a decent standard of living. What does the government need to do?
Today you are earning 10%, tomorrow you are earning 0%, and you don't know when it's going to flip from 10 to 0.
I, as a politician, I'm just not sure that I'm going to be around after 2 years. You know, it's become a joke in international circles that the Pakistani Prime Minister, no Pakistani Prime Minister serves his or her term. Is that what's driving this short-termism in their minds, and therefore the boom and bust cycle in essence? And that's the reason why we're not growing, and that's the reason why we're poor?
The economy per se, or income levels per se. So in countries which are ethnically very diverse, you do need democracy, or you do need a political system which gives them the voice, which makes them heard, and which makes them feel empowered in a way which is going beyond economics itself.
What the military thinkers in Pakistan, who very much run this country, they say, well, there you are. We keep saying we need this long-term government. This is exactly what we're telling you. You don't need democracy. So how important is democracy as part of that whole equation of?
This is a military which is involved in real estate. This is a military which is involved in every other sector where you can make profits. This is the military which is today now also involved in making the laws which are going to, or regulate the laws or influence the laws through SIFC, which are going to govern the rules of the game in those sectors in which the military itself is operating as probably one of the biggest players. It doesn't work because now you will end up making policies to basically watch out for your own economic or business interests. Right. And that is not the system which is going to get you growth.
Ahmed, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Ahmed, so what's going on with Pakistan? I mean, we are this country, or Pakistan was this country that was racing ahead in the 1950s until the 1990s. And, you know, our elite had the best cars. And if I can say it's tongue in cheek, and Indians had cars which the doors opened the wrong way around. Pakistan's poverty level was below that of India. You know, Indians suffered from what is called the Hindu rate of growth. And now Pakistan's this sick man there's this term sick man in Europe for the United Kingdom. So we can say, you know, Pakistan is that sick man in Asia. So what happened to Pakistan? Why did it get left behind? Is this like the tortoise and the hare kind of race where Pakistan just went off and snoozed because it thought it was doing so well?
No, I think that the easier way to imagine this will be this example. So think about an average Pakistani. What is their income level today? If I was to give an example, or the one which I love is this. So a median or an average Pakistani, they don't even have enough income over the year to buy a good high-end iPhone. Right? Now, if that's where you're starting from, how much industrialization can happen? How much of manufacturing activities can you set up? You can do the basic things, like let's say textiles. You can do some, let's say, informal manufacturing like toys. You can do some utensils, cutlery, like things which you need on day-to-day basis, and they don't cost much.
Right.
But when it comes to big manufacturing or things which you need to rise up the value chain or to become more productive and compete with the rest of the world. You can't do that. It's
Is
not a
that
big
because, if I
market.
can just cut you there just to understand, is that because you're saying that we don't have the domestic demand? Is that why you're saying that we can't do the industrialization part in Pakistan?
And that's critical. So beyond a certain level, you need demand, you need big market. Now, this is not a new idea. This is something which was discussed back in the 60s and the 70s. All the development economists at the time were concerned that many of these small economies, they're not big enough to go beyond a certain threshold. And then the problem was, what do you do? And that was also one of the important reasons why many of these economies ended up opening up, both regionally and also globally, so that they can sort of benefit from the bigger economy that will result from this integration and then drive growth. And that is where we lag behind. If today you look at the data from Asian Development Bank, which has data for 62 countries or so, and you see how Pakistan compares with all of the economies there in terms of how integrated you are with the rest of the world in terms of openness. And there are different measures. It could be how much you're importing and exporting, or it could be how much you're integrated with the supply chains. It turns out Pakistan is actually at the very, 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 very bottom of all those 62 Asian economies which the ADB covers in that database. Now, that is where the problem is. But that's only a symptom, if you ask me. Yes, it's easy to say we should open up, and that's good because that will give us bigger economy. But the fundamental question is, why are we not opening up? Right? Why are we not opening up? And why is it that India and Bangladesh, they were able, or likewise, East Asian economies are probably a better example. They were able to open up in a way that transformed their economies from 80s or 90s onwards, but we didn't.
Are you saying we're not opening up to the world and that's the reason we're poor?
That's one important reason, right? And the fundamental question then is, why are we not opening up?
Okay, so we'll come to that, but that's to do with the fact that we're not trading with our largest country, who's our neighbor.
Importantly, yes.
And you say if we trade with that largest country, India, we would be richer.
Together with other things. So if you trade not just India per se, it's regionally, right? So if you trade with the regional economies, become integrated, then clearly that's a win-win scenario that will play out. I don't want to say that if you open up tomorrow and everything is going to change for good. You obviously need a lot more investment, let's say, in your skills, in your human capital, in your institutional frameworks. All of those things are still fundamentally important. But without a bigger market, all of those things will probably not take you too far.
Okay. So trade is one issue. What's the second issue why we're poor? I'm sorry, I'm dumbing it down, but I just want to go make it really easy for us to understand, because when we get stuck in these complexities of technical jargon, it just goes over people's heads. I don't understand why I'm poor, and the average Pakistani does not understand why he's poor. He wants to have a decent standard of living. What does the government need to do to give him that decent standard of living?
So the other thing why we are poor is lack of investment. Now, I think everyone knows what investments are, but they are also very important when we think about productivity. When we think about productivity in the terms of how much should an average worker get paid, right? Not in a moral or social sense of the word, but how much they are producing, and therefore, against that, how much they should be getting paid. Now, how much they should be getting paid, meaning how productive they are, that really depends on how much capital, which we economists normally refer to, let's say machines, let's say computers, let's say phones, or even in today's world, you have intangible capital like internet, like software, like even you can extend this beyond and say social capital, like the trust levels in the economy between the people and so on and so forth. All of those things are super important to drive productivity and therefore then to drive wages. And that's where we are lacking. That's where we are falling behind. There's not enough investment. There's not enough capital to complement the labor so they can actually produce more. And therefore, not only the case that we are falling behind, but also wages in our country are not rising. And again, back to the fundamental problem: if wages don't rise by enough, again you're stuck in a low income trap, because
so we can't buy anything, and therefore the economy is not growing. I mean, I saw some figures and I was shocked. India's savings are around 30% of GDP. Its investment rate. Pakistanis are around 10%. And even Bangladeshis are around 30%. China's far ahead. I mean, China's around 45, 50%.
Yeah.
But so we're almost 1/3 of what India is.
Hmm.
So is that the issue, that we're just not investing? And then how do we solve that particular issue then?
So, and that's very interesting, because that's where things get harder as well, to figure out why are we not saving enough, or why are we not investing enough. Also, just for the audience sake, it's also very interesting, because a lot of the time the discussion is about households like you and I. Why are we not saving enough and therefore investing enough? So much of the attention is actually paid there, but that kind of hides the actual issue. Why? Because if you look at the data for China, half of the savings are simply coming from corporate savings, like firms, businesses. So they are saving. What are savings in their case? The savings for them are, they make profits and then they reinvest those profits, rather than take them home and then spend on consumption goods, and that's it, end of the story, right? In our case, if you look at the data, we don't have very good data on how much the savings are due to, let's say, firms and so on and so forth. But if you take the best of the best we have got, say those who are listed on the stock market, and you look at what do they do with their profits on average. On average, if you look over the last, let's say, 15, 20 years, for which State Bank has made the data available, they give away 50% of the profits in dividends, right?
Okay.
So it's not just that the households are not saving, it's also the firms and the best of the best that we have got. It's also them who are not saving. And then the question is, why are they not saving? If you're not investing in capital and you just keep on spending, there's only so much growth you can have, right? Because at the end of the day, if you look at the long-term story, you need capital, you need machines, you need software, you need trust, all of that, you need that to be there to support a sustainable increase in wages, and therefore a sustainable increase in consumption, which is again important for the reasons we discussed before. So here, coming back to the point, so this is really important to understand that it's not just the households who are not saving and investing enough, it's also the firms who are not saving and investing enough. And then the question is, why is it that they're not saving and investing enough? So often a lot of the discussion goes into the idea that maybe we have too much of red tape in terms of bureaucracy, maybe we have too much of corruption, maybe XYZ is not good, and maybe if we do that, it might actually work better. Surely all those things matter. But then let's also ask a question, then all of the countries who are now better than us or growing at a faster rate than us, they probably had the same kind of problems back in the 80s or the 90s when their savings went up quite a bit, or their investment rates went up quite a bit.
But don't they say that about India, that one of the key things of the Indian economy, what happened to the Indian economy in the 1990s, was when Manmohan Singh got rid of what they called the license Raj. Now, the license Raj seems like a fascinating term to me. It seems like this exotic thing. But I'm assuming in essence, it comes down to the bureaucracy and the red tape, right? Which in Pakistan, we haven't given it that exotic term. So India got rid of some elements of that, which helped it to grow. So there are elements that other countries did work on that, which you're saying that Pakistan hasn't worked on yet.
So they are. So let's pick up this example. So India liberalizes in 1992. If you look at the data in terms of how much money came in from the rest of the world in the form of investments, that was quite substantial. Right? So it's on average, I don't know, like 3-4% of GDP every year. So that's a lot of money that came in to India over the next 20-30 years. Now, at the same time, let me give you two other examples. In the case of Bangladesh, they didn't see that much money come in. They actually, on average, they actually saw less money come in than Pakistan saw.
Right.
China was obviously much better, even better than India. But let's focus on this. So India saw a lot of money come in. Pakistan also saw good enough money come in for the next 15-20 years, and more than Bangladesh. Right? But again, in our case, things turned out to be rather not so good, as in the case of, say, Bangladesh, in terms of how much improvement they have made over the last 30 years, not necessarily where they are with us relatively in terms of how rich they are as an individual. And India, and in the case of India, it turned out to be much better. Now, there again, the issue is this. So a lot of this money came in, but again, our savings rate continued to go down. So overall investments continue to go down as a proportion of GDP. Likewise, savings continue to go down as a proportion of GDP. One of the issues which is very different between us and everyone else is that our economy has been a lot more volatile. So there has been too much of boom and bust going on in our economy relative to, let's say, what we have seen in the case of Bangladesh or India or many of the other emerging economies. Yes, they had their crisis at one point or the other, but they didn't have the repeated crisis that we are having in the case of Pakistan, right? And that's very important, because even if investments in Pakistan are very profitable, which is what our policymakers and government officials keep on saying when they go from one country to another, what they don't talk about is the risk.
Right.
Yes, they are very profitable, fair enough, the returns are high, and there is some truth to it. If you look at PSE index and then you kind of do a bit of maths and you kind of see that on average returns are pretty decent. I won't say they are bad. So returns on their own, they're not the only reason why investment is not coming in. It's the risk people have to take to invest in Pakistan in terms of how volatile those returns are. Today you are earning 10%, tomorrow you are earning 0%, and you don't know when it's going to flip from 10 to 0 and how long it's going to stay there.
So is Pakistan different to India and Bangladesh when it comes to these boom and bust cycles? Why are we having these and they're not, and they're growing steadily?
So so Pakistan is very different. So and that is why I think this is probably one of the very important reasons for why we have such low levels of investments, and why I think probably bureaucracy per se, or some of the other things that we talk about per se, like how skilled our labor is per se, I probably think they matter for sure, but I don't think they are the deciding factor when I look at the experience of other economies, right? Other countries. So the boom and bust cycle is important. And then the question is, why do we have this boom and bust cycle? And this also kind of goes back to the trade story as well. So we have the boom and bust cycle because we cannot sustain growth over a longer period. And that also ties in very nicely with what's going on the political side of the story, because it's all about short-termism, right? You take reforms when you are thinking about, let's say, the next 5-10 years, because they're not going to pay you back in the next 2 years, right? They're going to take longer. When you undertake reforms, things are going to roughen up. People are going to lose their jobs. Some industries might do better, others might not do better. So there will be this transition which has to happen for things to settle down before you can actually reap the political benefits of doing that. And because the whole because that's not there, the kind of short-termism that's synced into our decision-making process, that doesn't really let the reforms take place.
So you're saying that the boom bust cycle, which is not allowing us to grow and become richer as Pakistanis, is directly related to the instability of the political system. Is this what you're saying, basically?
I'm very much.
I, as a politician, I'm just not sure that I'm going to be around after 2 years. You know, it's become a joke in international circles that the Pakistani prime minister, no Pakistani prime minister serves his or her term. Is that what's driving this short-termism in their minds, and therefore the boom and bust cycle, in essence? And that's the reason why we're not growing, and that's the reason why we're poor?
I think that's a very important reason, right? Because again, you have to think about, why are we different from others, right? In terms of every other thing I look at, I don't think Pakistan stands out. Like, we're not talking about today. Let's talk about 90s, right? Let's talk about mid 80s, when they started to grow and we didn't, right? We stagnated. What was different then, right? So that's the fundamental question. It's not that some country is now much better than us. That's a 30 years journey they have taken, but we have missed on. Right. So going back to the 90s, I don't see how Pakistan is fundamentally different from some of these other economies which we are talking about today, except the political system which doesn't let reforms happen. And reforms don't necessarily mean that every time you do something, it's going to work out. Reforms have to, you do reforms and they fail, right? But there has to be enough time to see that they have actually failed, so you can actually move on to another set of reforms and see whether they'll end up delivering better outcomes or not, right? So that experimentation on reform that's required, that actually does require a bit of a stable field on which you can actually worry a bit less about what's going to happen, let's say, in 2 years' time or 3 years' time.
You need democracy to do that, because from the way you're describing it, that you need stability, you need long-termism. It almost suggests that, you know, an authoritarian government can do the same thing. I mean, Bangladesh, for example, I mean, while India has definitely been a turbulent democracy and has achieved this, On the other hand, Bangladesh is technically been a democracy, but it's been a long government, a long time I mean, Sheikh Hasina has been around for over a decade now. And same with Modi now, in fact. I mean, this huge upswing that we're seeing in Indian growth has happened because Modi has been in power for over 8 years now. I mean, he came into power in 2014, and he's expected to win this election as well. So, I mean, when I think about what the military thinkers in Pakistan, who very much run this country, they say, well, there you are. We keep saying we need this long-term government. This is exactly what we're telling you. You don't need democracy. So how important is democracy as part of that whole equation of, how with the democratic system do you still ensure that a long-termism comes into economic policies?
I think so. So when we're talking about democracy, or when we're talking about this system or that system, right? At the end of the day, the fundamental question is really this: are the people who are going to run the country, what is the system that we can design which will make sure that the people who run the country, they care more or primarily about the interests of, let's say, the country itself, right? And they're not bogged down into their own petty interests, right? So that's the fundamental question. And the idea behind democracy is that this is probably the best of the worst systems, which can make sure that you can kick out people when they sort of deviate too much from national interest, and then you can bring in new people and see whether that works or not, right? Rather than, let's say, having a dictator there. But now, again, coming back to Pakistan's context, and because you mentioned military, so let's bring them in straight away. Now, with military, again, the problem is the problem is this: that they have their own institutional interests. This is a military which is involved in real estate. This is a military which is involved in every other sector where you can make profits. This is the military which is today now also involved in making the laws which are going to, or regulate the laws or influence the laws through SIFC, which are going to govern the rules of the game in those sectors in which the military itself is operating as probably one of the biggest players, if not the only player. Now, that doesn't work, right? Now, think about
why doesn't it work?
It doesn't work because now you will end up making policies to basically watch out for your own economic or business interests. Right. And that is not the system which is going to get you growth. Even in countries where you have, let's say, for example, let's talk about China, you don't have political players, even if it's a single party system, there's a very high amount of trust between the people and the party. And that trust obviously requires some degree of transparency or some degree of belief on the part of the citizens that these people are not in there to make money for themselves. And whenever that gets eroded, then obviously you are basically having a problem. Now today, again, for the Bangladesh, again, there's a lot of erosion of trust which is happening over the period of time, over certain years. And Bangladesh today is not doing as good as it was over the last 20 years. If you look at their export ratios, which is what we normally thought as a good measure of, let's say, performance or sustainable growth, that's almost back to Pakistan's level, only slightly better. And they are very much into textiles. That's the end of the story. They don't do anything else, which is where they can actually compete with the rest of the world in a way like, let's say, some of the other economies can. So that maintenance of trust, some degree of transparency is very important to get the government or the country going. And that with the military, with an institution that has its own business interests and very explicit business interests, that's not going to work out. Another issue is also the diversity of the people that are in the country, right? So you have to keep them together. So we say Ayub delivered a lot of growth, right? There's some truth to that as well. But in that growth, you ended up losing a lot of the communities, or let's say the Bengali nation. They ended up remaining behind. Many of the other ethnicities, they feel the same in Pakistan today. Balochistan is a case in point. So we have tried to, let's say, bring in Chinese investment in Gwadar and all of those places to sort of upstart the economy in the province and resolve the problem. But those things don't really go away just because you will end up doing better on economic front. Communities which are very diverse, they want empowerment in different ways and not just in economic ways. And
So
that
this is one of the questions I was going to ask you. This social contract which any state has with its people, how important is that in an economy flourishing?
so that's super important. I mean, think about again China. China is not a diverse country at all. China is probably a very good example of of complete lack of diversification in terms of ethnicities, right? So that makes life a bit more simple in terms of, let's say, having one party there representing only one community, big community, which kind of politically matters, if at all. Uh, and that's the end of the story. In India, if it was, let's say, something of that sort, if you try to repeat that in India, that wouldn't work at all, because India is a very diverse country. People want to be empowered in different ways. They want to be heard in a political sense of the word, in a social sense of the word. And it's not just about, let's say, the economy per se or income levels per se. So in countries which are ethnically very diverse, you do need democracy, or you do need a political system which gives them the voice, which makes them heard, and which makes them feel empowered in a way which is going beyond economics itself. And if you don't have that there, if you don't have that there, then you will certainly lose the trust that is needed to keep the whole thing going.
Okay.
And that is what happened in the 70s in Pakistan.
Okay, so this is where I just want to say. So you're saying that trust that the people have with its government is essential and is brought by democracy in essence, even though it might mean lower economic growth rate in the short term, but without it, you're not going to get economic growth rate. And if you keep taking away the people's trust from the democratic system, that's the reason why, for example, economic growth doesn't happen. So, I mean, from everything you're saying, it seems like Pakistan is this cancer patient, right? The economy is a cancer patient. Is there any chemotherapy we can do to improve the economy, or is it that's it? Is it on a terminal decline?
I mean, it's not a terminal decline. You don't want to give up on the people, right? So the people are there. They have been fighting for their rights and for prosperity for the last 70 years or so. So they haven't given up on themselves. So who are we to give up on the people as well? So let me say one thing, and then I'll come to the answer to the question that you're asking. So there's this short-termism, right? So that's one problem. The other problem is also the incentives of everyone else, right? So think about when we say that the economy is closed, the question is who's keeping it closed? Right? Someone must be keeping it closed, right? It's not closed on its own. So those who are keeping it closed are the people who actually make money from making sure that the economy remains closed.
Right.
And those people have significant voices in business groups. They then have now military is also there. It's one of the biggest business group you have in Pakistan in any sense of the word. So they are obviously interested in, let's say, making sure that their rents and profits remain intact. You have the landed elites. They don't want agriculture to be taxed, or they want money or taxpayers' money to keep on flowing into agriculture to make sure that there are incentives for farmers to grow whatever they want to grow and for their sugar mills to work and function and all of that, right? So all of that is also at play. And that is what is keeping the economy or the country very close, right? So that, and then you have this short-termism, which doesn't let reforms happen, even when, let's say, people vote in a party or someone within the government, whichever government that is strong enough to give it a shot, right? Just to see what happens, right? So it's together. So it's not just this or just that. So it's that system which is keeping the economy really in its stranglehold. And then the short-termism on the part of the policymakers or the political class, which does not allow them to do any kind of experiments which will risk their hold on power or the political setup or on the government. So, and that's important. So you do need, let's say, a political representation which is strong enough and which is willing to do reforms. And those reforms are not going to be easy. Those reforms are going to threaten all this whole edifice, which is essentially holding the country back, right? And which includes the landed elites, which includes the military, which includes also the big business groups, not all of them, but many of them. So someone will have to kind of disturb them.
Right.
If not,
and what's going to disturb them? You're saying trade is going to disturb them, basically?
It could be trade. It could also be, let's say, tomorrow you wake up and you say, well, we don't really need to produce sugar. We can just import it from elsewhere. And then if the sugar mills,
Why would you, though? If Jahangir Tareen, for example, is in your government, why would you ever say that? I mean,
you
isn't
won't.
that one of the issues, that all these feudal landlords or corporate interests are in government? For example, I mean, now we have a banker who's the finance minister. I mean, we've always had we've had bankers very regularly. But if you have those interested parties in your government, how will you ever make those reforms?
Then you won't make the reforms, right? But then again, you have to remember, so all of the way politics happens
I'm so sorry to interrupt at this point, but it just came to me as you were saying that. So you'll never make those reforms. This is what you've just said. And the thing that came to me is the only time you'll end up doing that is if you have trade, then you're going to have to do something because outsiders have come into your country and they're now putting you on the spot. Maybe that is the reform that's quite underrated in our country in a way, because we've tied it with all the political implications of that. But if you have outsiders coming in, they're not part of your system. Maybe that is the catalyst that you need.
Not necessarily. I mean, the question is, why will anyone let you open, right? Think about the insider, right? So even, for example, it's very interesting because when you say outsiders, you think, okay, fine, outsiders will come and they'll make you reform. Think about Toyota. They came and they actively lobby for the government to keep the market or the auto market closed because they make profits by extracting rents from the people, to say it in a blunt way. And the Japanese ambassador, he's they're always very active in, let's say, keeping the government on the right side, so that their business keeps on, their business interests are watched out for. But the problem is this. So the kind of democracy that we have or the setups that we have, they're always controlled. We know that, right? They are only in place if they can be controlled. If they cannot be controlled, like if I go back to, let's say, Bhutto, right? Whether we agree with his policies or we don't agree with his policies, that's a different story. But he had a certain kind of worldview, certain kind of reform agenda which he wanted to implement. But because he was out of control, or he may have been out of control after he got the majority he got in 1977, we didn't like it. Or go back further to Mujib, right? He won straight away. And then if he was to take over, he wouldn't have listened to, let's say, the army or the landed elites. He would have done what he wanted to do. Good or bad, forget that. But he would have done as per his own agenda, which he had presented to the people and people had signed up for.
Right. So once again, you're supporting
that happened. Today, you are back to square one.
Right.
PTI or Imran Khan, whatever. So they were.
Okay. So coming to the solutions for the chemotherapy for this cancer patient, what is it?
Okay. So now there are two ways forward, right? So one way forward is what is often also argued by Duncan, the guy who wrote the book on what's the name of the book? I'm forgetting.
Stephen Durkin.
His book, Gambling on Development or something along that lines. So his argument is that the elite should realize that this is not sustainable, and there are many reasons for why this is not sustainable, and they should sit together and they should decide to reform the country because that's good for the country and that's also good for them. Right? So that's one way forward, and that is why you're also hearing a lot of this discussion on Charter of Economy or Charter of ABC. Essentially, the idea is let's sit together and then we'll work out what is needed. Forget the people, forget everything else. It's a
elite-driven,
top-down kind of approach, right? The elites come together, they decide what's good for the country, and they go with it. Right? Now, that's one way to go by. The other way to go by is more along the lines of what Echemoglu and Robinson, these guys, talk about, right? So Echemoglu, for the reader, the guy who has written the book on why nations fail, and more recently he has some other books out as well. So their thesis is more along the lines of that it's the people who actually struggle and who ask for representation. Right? And it's actually, they're asking for representation and they're asking for resources, which imposes a cost on the elites, right? And it is that competition, right, over representation, over resources between the masses and the elites on one side and the other, which ultimately results in democracy or a more free or liberal society, right? not necessarily liberal in a Western sense of the word, but a freer society where people have more say in how they want to govern their lives. Now, these are the two ways which can be thought about. I'm more inclined to think along the lines of the second one, the one which Echemoglu and Robinson they argue about. I think I had a discussion with Stephen Durkin, so on which of these ways may be better and could be a better way forward. Again, let me be very honest about this. It's always hard to say which one is better than the other in these things. But I think that the elites at the moment, their interests are so perverse. When I think about the direction which the country should be taking in terms of openness, in terms of moving away from agriculture, in terms of, let's say, forgetting about, let's say, saving sugar mills and so on and so forth for your progress, that their interests are so perverse. And again, military again is in there as a monopolist. Now they're also entering, let's say, the agri business, and they are getting the lands allocated to them as well. What does that mean? Whether that's good or not, but then once these big players, monopolists, are in a certain business, then they won't let things change when the time comes for things to change, right? Hypothetically speaking, say agriculture is good, say military gets in there. Let's say we don't have any ideological issue. Fair enough, get in there, do it. Tomorrow, if this is not good for one reason or the other, because situation changes, the global economy evolves, and the domestic economy needs to adapt to the changes in the global economy, then these groups are going to be so entrenched that they won't let that move or transition or adaptation happen.
Right.
And if you don't adapt to the changing environment around you, you're just going to go extinct, right?
Yep.
You're not going to evolve. Extinction is the most important part of evolution, right? If we speak that language. And that's the problem here. So if you let the elites sit together and sort out what the agenda is going to be, even if they manage to sort that out, let's say they end up figuring out the best possible scenario that should be played out, the system will be so rigid that it won't be able to adapt to the changes in the environment around you, right? And the global economy is going to be changing at an even faster pace as AI and everything else comes in. You need a system which is more adaptable, which is more flexible, and which is not so tied to the interests of the elites, which the first system will end up giving you, and which essentially we already have in place. Because it's not adapting, it hasn't adapted over the last 50 years to the changes that have happened in the global economy. So if I am to bet on which of the systems will probably work better, despite all its flaws and the uncertainties that come with it.
I don't want to conclude on this note, but in essence, what you're saying to me, unfortunately, seems to imply that we once again have this elite-driven consensus that this is the direction we need to go. And as far as I can gather, what you're saying is it's not going to get anywhere. So that means Pakistan is going to stay on this path now, going nowhere right now, unless some dramatic thing happens to the country which changes the direction. I mean, is that good? Is that right to say this is what you're basically saying?
Almost, but I take it back and then I'll say that the elite consensus which is happening, I won't say it's happening. The elite consensus has always been there, right? When you're protecting industries, when you have, let's say, people belonging to these protected industries sitting in the parliament or sitting in the government, one way or the other, when you have the military in there, there's already a consensus in terms of how you want to run the economy. And that consensus, because it's very much tied to the interests of the elites, and and those interests are very specific in nature, that kind of a system is very rigid. And that rigidity in the system is just going to drag you down, right? In the face of the changes in the global economy or the economy around you. And that is what has been happening. It's not that there's no consensus. There is a consensus. I completely disagree with when people say we need an elite consensus. What do we have right now? We have a consensus, but this way of running the country where you come up with a consensus which serves your interests, even if you get that right somehow accidentally, 10 years' time, that consensus is just going to be dragging you back down, right? So you need a system which is flexible, which is adaptable. And that system, if you can find another one, fair enough. Otherwise, in the current options that are available to us, that system is democracy, which represents people. And then it's not managed in any way where you plant your own people in one party or the other to basically make sure that your interests are watched out for.
Right.
So that's the system which probably is going to take us out of the scenario. And I don't want to give up on the people. The people have been fighting for it. I mean,
well, you haven't. If you said democracy is the system, that means you believe in the power of the people. So in essence, it's really interesting. What I've understood from this is, and I thought, you were going to give me all these lectures about this is how to solve the system. This is how to solve the system. We need to make this policy. We need to make this policy. You've said democracy is one of the key things. Let the people decide the policies in essence, and you will be on the right direction and you will grow. Emma, thank you so much for your time today. I know you've been juggling the balls. I was throwing different bottles at you and you were juggling away, but I'd really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
It was an interesting conversation. I thought it's going to be boring where you'll give me a question and then I'll just give you an answer from one of my papers here and there. And it will be the end of the story. But it ended up being more interesting than I thought.
Thank you so much.